All right. Hello and welcome to the Almost Got It show. I'm Ben Tauber. I'm an engineer, a founder with an acquisition of Google, former CEO of the notable Esalen Institute, and current CEO coach. And with me is my co-host Dylan Dane, who's an MIT engineer who escaped war-torn Sri Lanka to achieve his own exit as a founder to Google and is currently CEO of System 2, a fitness coaching platform on a mission to bring personalized coaching to 1 billion people. Together, we believe that we are living through the most important moment in human history. AI, longevity, and consciousness tech are all converging to give us seemingly godlike capabilities. Personally, we both transformed from shy, anxious children to the founders and humans that we are today. And we've learned that personal evolution is how you can thrive in a world that's experiencing exponential change. Every week on Almost Got It, we bring on scientists, builders, and visionaries that are pushing the very frontier of human potential. And together we go deep on what their breakthroughs mean for how you live, work, and evolve as a human being. Here today, we're with Jay Sanguinetti. Dr. Jay Sanguinetti is a frontier neuroscientist decoding the mind's potential through brain stimulation, mindfulness, and scientific curiosity. As a CEO of Sandmine Technologies and a longtime collaborator with thought leaders like St. Young, he's pioneering new methods to expand awareness, treat mental health, and accelerate human thriving one neuron at a time. He's also the founder of the Science Enhanced Mindfulness Awareness Lab at the University of Arizona, and we're deeply honored to have him here with us today. So Dylan, you and I wanted to start this episode just a little bit differently. And part of that is talking about human potential and talking about this idea that you've been sharing about God mode. And so I want to start by telling one of my favorite stories to introduce the idea of human potential, right? And Jay, I know you know this well, but for some of our listeners, the human potential and the human potential movement sort of birthed out of this place called the Esalen Institute in the 60s. And conceptually, it's that we're much more than we think we are as humans. And what makes the difference is that we're limited by our own beliefs, by the beliefs instilled in us by our parents, by society, by religion about what's possible for us. And one of the best examples of this is Roger Bannister, right? And so Roger Bannister, in 1954, he was a runner. And one of the things that was believed to be true is that humans had a maximum speed that they could run. You just couldn't push past a 4-minute mile. And the belief is that if you did that, that just sort of outpaced what your heart could do, what your body's capacity could do. And there was one person, Roger Bannister, who believed that that wasn't true. And so one day he went out to the track and there was fanfare around this. There were doctors there ready to sort of resuscitate him and believing that he was just going to collapse. And so he runs it. And the amazing thing is he runs it in just under 4 minutes, right? And surprisingly, he doesn't collapse. Now, the thing that's interesting is not so much that he did it and broke the record, it's what happened next. And that's within weeks and months, hundreds and then thousands of other people broke the 4-minute mile. So what the heck happened? Did it suddenly just become possible? No, it was always possible. And yet just by believing that it could be done because we saw someone else do it, suddenly everyone could do this. And this is repeated on and on throughout history. And we believe that we're in one of the most incredible times in history. And so, Dylan, I wanted to give you the mic to talk about what's possible right now.
Yeah, I think that's a great story, and an analogy that I think about often is that, you know, if you have played a video game, a lot of people have, you start playing the video game, you're kind of, you know, you're shitty at it, you're like getting killed all the time. Every 5 minutes you die and you get respawned, and like you don't know what tricks and tools that you have to use to progress. But then you keep playing, and eventually you get to this thing the gamers call the God mode, right? And at that stage, you just like know all the backdoor hacks and all the key combinations that you have to hit and all that stuff, and you're basically cruising through. You're just like crushing your competition, having a great time. You're like unkillable. You're just like, going wherever you want, doing whatever you want. And when you think about the story of humanity itself, there's a strong analogy to this level of this type of story arc, right? People have for a long time kind of made this analogy that life is kind of a game, and there's reason to believe that that there is a progression towards a God mode in the game of life for humanity itself. We started out so primitive, just with people lived with a lot of suffering, and something that I think about oftentimes is even 100 years ago, childhood mortality rate was like 50%. What that meant is that, if you talk to anyone, like half their siblings were dead. If you talk to any woman, half the kids that they gave birth to were dead, and that's like that alone is unimaginable, tremendous suffering that we just do not deal with at all anymore. And that's just like in medical science, progression in medical science. But then there's so many other technologies that have come to play. We're solving problem areas around how to feed ourselves, take care of basic needs, and using technology like kind of address all kinds of other needs as well, and ultimately getting to the point where we are able to change our brain itself, change our kind of being and consciousness to a degree. You're not necessarily really beholden to suffer through, if you're born with, say, depression or some kind of other types of like mental illness or debilitation. That's not your destiny anymore. So all this is to say that that both as a result of technology and also technology-driven innovation, technology-driven ability for us to leave our own limiting beliefs behind. There, at least a portion of humanity is today already reaching a incredibly empowered state where you can truly live a kind of blessed life, doing what you love doing, and fixing all of your any ailments that you may have had, and just like enjoying every day as one should, as if you're living in heaven. So that to me is God mode, and I think our inspiration here was that as we've been talking to a number of guests on Almost Got It, we realized that this is something that we're really passionate about. This personal journey is something that both Ben and I have been through personally, and we're really excited and interested in discovering new tools and not just get better, but tools for becoming almost supernormal. Right? Like, can you become better than better? And so that's God mode to us, and we're excited to bring guests on board who are working on these cutting edge tools, and introduce to those tools to you all, and figure out how we can all elevate the human condition to something post-human almost.
Yeah, and so to start, Jay, I just want to thank you for joining us. You're a dear friend, and you inspire me with the work that you do, both the actual work that we get into from the targeted ultrasound technology, but also the ethics that you bring to it, of really, really deeply caring about how these powerful technologies can positively impact humanity. And so that continues to inspire me. So thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun with this conversation. So thanks for inviting me.
Yes. And so what we're sort of interested in to start is a little bit of your origin story, right? What was it that it could have been a moment of struggle, either in your own experience or others, that really formed you as a human, right? And got you into thinking about how to improve the human condition.
Yeah, it's a hard one because there's been so many of those moments in my life. And what I would say is each of the struggles. So I've experienced death of loved ones and friends and things from a very young age. I grew up in the South, where they allowed us to drive around on three-wheelers. Many of your listeners might not even know what that is, but there's side-by-sides or four-wheelers. When I was a child, they had three-wheelers, which was a really bad idea because they were super dangerous.
Where did you grow up, Jay?
I was born in Natchez, Mississippi. I grew up in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. So I am very deeply a Southern boy. I just somehow lost my Southern accent along the way. And I think it'd be cool to have the accent now as a scientist and a CEO. So, there was a lot of that as a child. And I think those experiences really, as you go through deep sort of life-altering experiences like that, you start asking the deeper questions of what's the point, what's the purpose, who am I, what am I doing here? I grew up Catholic, and so I'd often ask, why is God allowing this? Why would God allow, as a child, one of my friends to die on this machine that we have made to supposedly help us have fun, right?
It doesn't on the three-wheeler, one of your friends died.
Multiple friends passed away that way, hunting accidents, So I had a pretty, rich and challenging childhood. I got to grow up.
Did that, as a child especially, it's really hard to sometimes process feelings like this because you wholeheartedly believe that this, the universe is supposed to be this way, and there's this but it's God or someone that's protecting you, and then these things happen. I don't know. I'm just curious how did you process those feelings or conflicts?
I think as a child, it forces you to process very complex emotions that you're not really capable of yet. You don't really have the skills to process that, and it really forces you to realize the world might not be as safe as you thought it was. And every child has to learn this at some point, but going through death, especially as a child, really forces you to the fact that there might be a boogeyman, and that boogeyman might be a car. So, for example, one of my friends got hit by a car right in front of me while we were riding bicycles in third grade. And I actually developed something called aphantasia. So I can't visualize when I close my eyes. I have no capacity to see. If you ask me to see a red apple, until very recently, and I can tell you the story, I couldn't visualize. And so that's, the brain sort of has certain mechanisms to deal with that level of trauma as a child. But on the flip side, that really forced me to ask some deeper questions, like, why would God allow this as a Catholic growing up? Why does God allow suffering? How do I deal with it? And how do I eventually bring God's love back into that suffering in order to be safe, fundamentally in this world? And so even though I'm not practicing Catholic anymore, that sort of upbringing and that container really helped me try to integrate, sort of that deep contradiction of if God is all loving, why would this happen? And God is all loving. How can I bring that back into these experiences and try to be a whole human being? And as a child, that's like an impossible task, but I think it started me on that path, very early.
May I ask, I'm curious, what did that processing look like as a child, for example, with that friend who was killed by the car? Was it walking in the woods? Was it talking with a priest? Was it intellectual? Was it somatic? What did it look like then?
In Catholic school, we had a lot of great nuns. And so I was mostly processing with our nuns, who helped you process indirectly. As a child, you can never really confront the thing head on because it doesn't make sense. And so a lot of the process is sense making in the way that makes sense to that person at that age, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, very young mind. And so, in sort of a strange way, I was forced to do some deep sense making at a very early age. And I feel like I've carried that skill and that process along the way. And to be honest, you know, you never really process it all as a child. You do it over and over again as an adult. And so even, you know, fast forwarding to now, I have my own child. I have a 9-month-old baby. And I'm still processing some of that, you know, deeper, unsettled, the lack of safety, you know, some of that stuff. But now I have the skills on top of that to really be able to go into that and to use the different tools that I have in my life to realize that there is still work to be done there. And that's okay, you know, because now I can go into it. And I can, as an adult, I can go down the layers of my own self to that child that's still in there, somewhere in the system, and, you know, re-love it, reparent it, you know, do all the things that need to be done for it so that I can now show up for my child and help her through whatever she's going to deal with.
Well, and just to stay with this for a moment, I'm curious about what does that actually look like, right? I'm a father. I've got a 5.5-year-old. Fortunately, he hasn't had a deep experience with death yet, but we never know, right? He's got such a deep connection with his grandma and grandpa, and you know, one day they might not be here. I'd be curious, like, what guidance would you have for me in supporting him, or what do you do with your inner child today?
Yeah, you know, a lot of it is really meeting them where they are, or meeting yourself where you are at that level. And that's sometimes really hard work because it requires a lot of presence of really, and it's very hard for us as adults now to really think, what's it like to be a 5-year-old again? And, you know, spending time with your child, you have to just really tune in to them and you sort of do the work to really tune into that channel and say, what's happening on this channel? What's the world like from the point of view of this lens, you know, a 5-year-old's lens who's dealing with this new concept of its death for the first time, and all the things that come along with that. And actually, some of it is not obvious. Like I can tell you now, going back into my own work, there's actually a lot of anger as a child when you deal with death, because the system thought the world was a certain way. I thought it was safe. My parents told me it was safe. There's supposed to be Santa Claus and snow and candy canes, and you know, and now things can be gone and it doesn't make any sense. And there's anger and frustration and all these things on a fundamental level. And so really meeting the child at that level and helping them work with those emotions and validating them, normalizing them, and giving them the foundation for, like, this is okay too. It's a totally okay response to something that doesn't make sense, and actually it'll never make sense, you know. But helping them like really lean into that, you know, that's the really hard work, because I think even in my own case, you know, I'm very busy and got a lot going on, and then all of a sudden death happens, and you have to sort of shift your focus and attention to that. And we actually did experience that when my daughter was 3 months old. Her grandfather passed away unexpectedly. And so we had just had a baby. And it was like the last thing that we were prepared for. A very, very healthy grandparent to her grandfather, who was probably the healthiest 65-year-old we knew. And he passed away in the gym. He was working out. He was a very, very healthy guy. And he had what's called a Widowmaker's heart attack.
Don't mind me asking, was it a cardiac arrest type thing?
Yeah, it's called a Widowmaker's heart attack. So it's the type of heart attack that'll kill you right away. So thankfully he didn't suffer all that much. But then we were left on the other side, you know, tired from the labor and pregnancy, you know, now having a baby.
So sorry to hear that. But and the I don't know, like the biohacker in me is so curious. Like, how did that even happen? Like, was he kind of getting regularly tested and none of that showed up in his tests? And like, that's really shocking.
Yeah, unfortunately, he did not have a heart scan. So you can do scans like heart flow. There's these other things. I highly recommend that anybody who's listening who's 35 or above, go get a heart flow scan. So it probably would have found it, and he just, we didn't know because he was so healthy, you know, you wouldn't even think to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I just did a Clearly scan last year and found, I'm 42. And so I have some soft plaque in that Widowmaker area. And so I'm so grateful that my doctor pushed to do that scan. I mean, it's $1,500, but now that I've modified my diet, I'm taking the statins and things like that. And at our age, it's reversible, right? So my goal is to get to no plaque. But I'm so sorry for that loss. One thing I'm sort of curious, because you're talking about coming into presence and helping your inner child do the sense making. What does that actually sort of look like or sound like? I mean, I imagine it's sort of in your mind, sort of having an internal dialogue, but I know how I do that with my son. You get down on their level, there's physical comfort, I sort of narrate their experience because sometimes they're not aware of it's like, oh, you're like, hey, Killy, you're angry. And then he's like, oh, he like suddenly realizes like that's what's going on. What does it look like for you?
Like in my own personal process, you mean?
Yeah, in your process.
Yeah, very similar. I tend to think of human beings as being these parts that are composing a whole, and the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. And so a lot of the work for me personally and interpersonally, interdynamically, is really trying to hold space for those different parts and trying to really listen to them in the way you're listening to Killian, your son. And some parts know more than the other parts, actually. And some parts really want to hold on, because they have a reason that they're there. They're there to protect me from some way. And especially if I'm really doing that work, those parts that were sort of solidified when I had some of those challenging childhood experiences, they have purpose. They're there for a reason. And so, it's sort of validating that and understanding why it's there, and then allowing the maybe more mature parts that have the language or the sort of ability to make sense out of what's going on, holding space for them in the same way. And a lot of that comes up on retreats, on my meditation practice, when I'm really holding space for all of it, and it's quiet and still enough that those parts can be seen. That's the place that's really important work, because sometimes they don't want to be seen, and maybe the way your child sometimes when he's angry, he doesn't want to fully know, because he also wants to go play and he also wants to eat, and so there's these conflicting parts in there, and you're like, okay, it's okay, but we'll let that anger vibrate a little bit, so you can not hold on to it, and learning that skill of just having openness to those difficult emotions so that they don't have to be held on to. I think that's a really key process.
Yeah, this is probably a much bigger discussion, but I am curious about your kind of personal take on the kind of how consciousness forms through different parts, whether it's whether it's like the theory that there's a bunch of different essentially conscious entities that work together to create the observer that you call yourself, or something else.
Definitely could talk for hours on that one.
Yeah. Well, why don't we get into that later?
I'm happy to. Definitely happy. I guess, from the highest level, what I would say is I'm a bit of a panpsychist in that I think even the cells are conscious to a very limited definition of consciousness.
Right.
And I think I would actually use the word awareness more than consciousness. And I think when you have the right bits of matter that have a certain type of awareness fitting together mathematically, by that I just mean in a network. So there's these parts fitting together in a network of interdependence and interconnectivity. You get the type of consciousness that we have, which is this sort of self-referential, what the neuroscientists called autonoetic. It has a point of view. That type of consciousness emerges when you have this massively dynamic, interconnected parts all working together in a certain way. And it's an illusion, but it's real. And so happy to get into that. But it's part illusion, part real, and part just the emergence of all of these parts working together.
One question on that. A few weeks ago we had a dear mutual friend of ours, Jonathan Schooler, on, talking about his nested observer window theory. How is the panpsychist approach? And panpsychist, that's that there's a little bit of consciousness throughout everything. Would that be the appropriate definition?
That's the most extreme one. There's different versions. Some people would say rocks are conscious, and some people would stop at that level of matter. I'm open to everything being composed of awareness, which means I'm a full and sort of crazy panpsychist for some people. But that's my direct experience, and I'm sticking to it. But as a scientist, what you might say is everything that is living perhaps has this form of awareness. So I would say even the little bits on the microtubule, there's these little machines inside your cells that are carrying matter and carrying, sort of materials across your cell. I would say even those are conscious, because how do they know what they're doing? Right? And so they're little conscious machines.
Amazing.
When did you first decide that the brain is where you want to spend your life on, Jay?
Oddly, it was when I was looking through a telescope. So
okay.
I don't actually know if I've said this publicly, but I guess I feel comfortable saying it now. I became a scientist because of the TV show The X-Files.
Dude, the X-Files had a huge left a huge impression on me. It was definitely like, yeah, I totally agree. It was like it was life changing.
Me too. And I was really obsessed with life in the universe, so UFOs and aliens, and I really wanted to go in that direction. And so I ended up going to NASA camp, and I was looking through a telescope and looking for the UFOs. And I guess the way I would say it poetically is I didn't find UFOs and life in the universe, but when I looked through the telescope, I saw myself in sort of a very cosmic way, in that the whole thing opened up. I mean, what I was experiencing was the size of the universe is so unimaginably big. And, then you turn that around and you kind of look into the depths of, the fact that every atom is 99.9% space. And so that the little tiny, and all my life I've had these experiences of expansion, contraction. I've always had these kind of weird, especially when I was falling asleep as a kid. And so I had this moment of looking through the telescope of seeing like, oh my God, I understand now how far a light year is. Yeah. And then knowing, I'd already known a little bit of biology and knowing like how tiny all this stuff is inside of me. Yeah. And that opened me up to the whole question of what the hell is going on? Like, what am I? How is this happening? How am I looking through a telescope and seeing the whole universe? And, just really wanted to know, like, how's all this matter coming together to make this experience possible in the first place? And so I wanted to be an astronomer. So what I would say is I never found the UFOs, but I found astronomy and brain science. And I wanted to be an astronaut and an astronomer, but I was pretty bad at math. And so I went from sort of astronomy to astrobiology and started thinking about, like, what about life instead?
I love that. Just remind me, when most kids have their room filled with posters of, I don't know, whatever, like musicians, sports icons. I had this poster of the X-Files poster that said the truth is out there. You know what I'm talking about? With
I have that in my office.
There you go.
Oh man, I see the bromance growing here.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is I have it in my closet. So when I'm on podcasts and things, you can't see it. But every once in a while, I'll open the closet for people who really want to know.
Now you got to open the closet. Is it literally right there?
No, I'm at my friend's house right now, so it's not in this closet.
That's awesome.
So I'm a closeted, definitely UFO hunter.
Amazing. Well, and then I'm curious, where was the moment where you were looking at the brain or mental health and thought, like, there has to be a better way, right? Because now, and we're going to get into this coming up shortly, just the work that you do and the impact that has on the brain and on consciousness. But where did that motivation arise from?
I've had a lot of friends and family members deal with addiction, specifically alcohol and opioid addiction more recently. And, I think I went through a deep lesson that I think our whole culture has now gone through over the past couple decades, which is very simply that reducing pain does not reduce suffering. And this is a Buddhist concept as well. I mean, we've known this as a human species for thousands of years, but I think our culture is growing into this wisdom. And not only that, but what we saw with the opioid crisis is you can actually take a chemical and reduce pain, and you can increase suffering. So these things are so unattached to each other, you can get an anti-correlation.
Well, and can you give us, what is the definition of the two? I think so many people equate pain and suffering as a single thing. There could be physical pain, there could be, emotional, psychological pain, and we just sort of use pain, suffering interchangeably. How do you see them as different?
Yeah, usually in the neurosciences and psychology, they're defining pain as a sensory experience that's driving you to reduce that sensory experience. And so pain is not good or bad. It's actually something driving you to a certain behavior. The suffering on top of it is the sort of good or bad piece. I want it to go away. Things should be different. My back, the signal in my back, which is a pain signal, is too intense, right? Too intense is a human experience, right? And I can measure that intensity on a pain scale. But, the thing is I can bring in a long-term meditator or someone who's just done an ayahuasca ceremony and done a lot of psychedelics and blasted away their ego. You can turn that pain signal up and it's totally fine for a certain amount of time, right? And so the pain signal itself is not the problem. It's how you interface with it. That's what causes the suffering. And it's really this sort of resistance to it. And usually, most cases, and sometimes it can be the grabbing on. Chronic pain can actually you can hold on to that pain. And by holding on to it, you can make the next pain signal worse. And so really disentangling these two things, which is like a sensory experience from a psychological experience, which is suffering, I think is really the key that our whole culture is going through right now.
Yeah. So just put a finer point on this. The psychological component is essentially the narration that we do, that inner monologue about the pain signal. This shouldn't happen, or this is bad, or it's that positive, negative valence, or in this case, the negative valence that we would assign to the pain.
Yep, absolutely. And everything that comes after that. So every sensory experience that's following from that, which in some cases can increase the pain signal, which increases I don't want this to happen signal, which then increases inflammation, which increases the pain signal. And you get stuck in this loop of suffering. And so, yeah, it's really that sort of resisting at the fundamental level what is happening in the system, which leads to all these downstream types of experiences.
Yeah. Well, and Dylan, I kind of want to put you on the spot here a little bit. You've done some Vipassana retreats, and I remember you sharing in detail sort of being with physical discomfort. Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah. When you do a Vipassana retreat, especially one of these 10-day silent meditation type things, you play a lot with the ability to observe pain but not attach to it, and you can definitely experience states where you're in pain and discomfort, but that does not cause suffering, and you're somewhat detached from it, and you might in fact be having a blissful experience while your body is experiencing pain. So that's quite fascinating.
Yes, and I think that's the key. Is it's the mismatch between expectation and what is. And that mismatch in the system can cause distress or other types of valence, like you said. It causes the system to get out of balance emotionally. And that then can cascade in certain cases. There's a theory right now that we can get into if you're interested called predictive coding that basically says your brain is, and any part of your nervous system is creating predictions about what's going to happen. So a really clear example is my baby's learning, my baby Rosemary is learning how to walk. Walking is called controlled falling in neuroscience. And when you watch a baby, it's very clearly controlled following, and her brain starts learning, if I lift my leg, it's the cutest little thing. She's learning to lift her little legs up. She's learning, if I lift my leg, I can stop the fall. So that's a prediction. But every once in a while, the prediction goes haywire and she gets a little too confident or whatever, and she falls. Now we've got pain and suffering, right? Because we got the pain signal and we've got the distress that's following from that. And so you can follow that whole model all the way through to an adult human being. You know, I promised we wouldn't talk about politics, so we'll talk about climate change. So, you know, people should not be driving SUVs, right? And when I go out and I see someone driving an SUV, there's a mismatch between my expectation and the sensory input. Right. Because it's like, this is not what I want. I want everyone to be driving like Miatas and, you know, tiny little cars. And it's, you know, like what you're saying is if you practice into just being present with the sensory data, then at a certain point, you can reduce the expectation down to sensation itself. And I actually think that's one way to define enlightenment. If we're getting very reductionist in our definition of what is an enlightened human being, it would be a human being whose predictions about the world and their sensory inputs are matching 100%. Therefore, there's no way to have a mismatch of expectations, and therefore no way to suffer.
So that's a fascinating idea. And just to run with that for a moment, when you say their predictions about the world are matching, are they getting better at predicting, or are they no longer trying to make these higher order predictions, right? Like you gave a good example of your brain is predicting that, hey, if everyone knows about climate change, then they should all be driving Miatas and Priuses, and then that's not the case. Whereas you sort of said that an enlightened person may be simply predicting their own internal sensory experience. So is it a question of like orders of abstraction?
Orders of abstraction due to the practice itself. And I think that's what's so powerful about practicing presence with sensory data. We can call that mindfulness or whatever you want to call it, is that you're getting out of the narrative consciousness. My friend Rao Khan calls that form of consciousness narrative awareness. And I think that's a beautiful phrase. And there's nothing wrong with narrative awareness, by the way. It's just, it creates a story, a narrative view of reality, which is very functional as a social unit, but it's not what's happening in the sensory data. Or you can look at narrative awareness as a sensory experience itself. That's a little case where you can use it to just watch the narration. And I like to do that sometimes, just invent little narrations.
It sounds like it's narrative consciousness or really rumination, right? Like it's almost an unnecessary layer of prediction that is going on. That is, it's not necessary for your survival most of the time. And except you just can't avoid, like, just can't help but keep doing it. And most people constantly are ruminating or kind of, you know, indulging in narrative consciousness, which ends up with predictions that don't match with reality. And maybe as you get closer to enlightenment, just stop doing that, you know?
Yes, exactly. And it's really important for the thing inside of you, which we'll call the self or the ego, which is really the amalgam of a bunch of little parts, as we talked about. That thing is trying to figure out what to do about climate change, which is a real problem. And I think a real human thing that it's trying to figure out. And for me, you know, we might want to talk about this, but it drove me to the point where I said, I shouldn't have a child in this world. The thing inside of me that was so worried about climate change, it was a really genuine worry, is trying to do the best it can with the very limited cognitive capacities and inputs that it has. And it's its own narrative structure, the self, right? And so it's just trying to say, I need to be mad about this SUV because that helps me on some level maintain my reality so that I can ultimately do the thing you're trying to do, which is figure out what to do about climate change. And as you said, that whole process is so energy intensive. Whereas if, you know, another way to think about that is I can be present with the fact that there's a sort of amalgam of matter, there's just steel and crap put together in this SUV, and there's a human being doing the best that they can in this world, driving that SUV. This whole process of being angry at that and suffering from that isn't actually helping me figure out what to do about climate change or whether I should have a baby or not. Right. Actually, it's taken me away from that. And that's just helping the self thing maintain its whole narrative thing. Right. And so it's not just a perception thing, but I think it's also like a knowing what you are at a deeper level, so that deeper level can get on with doing the deeper work.
Well, I have so many directions that I want to take this at once. So
that's why I was laughing.
I've fragmented myself internally. But so one question I have is, it seems to me in this theory of predictive coding, and forgive me for putting you on the spot, Jay, but there's a way that the narrative part of your mind is making this fundamental error, right? Like if every day you walk out and you're shocked that someone is driving an SUV, it's like, what's going on in the system that it's continuously making this prediction that is sort of wrong every day? Because I imagine you think a lot about that, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's something you've noticed.
Yeah, well, I would say most of the examples we give are projecting. So this example comes from my own experience, because I this was a real problem for me for a long time. And what I would say, part of the insight that I had around that process in myself was that that's a way to resolve the conflict. Because every time I see an SUV, I would be like, and that allowed me to not do the deeper, what do I do? It actually resolved the conflict that my system has to do something about climate change. And what it did was it got angry. and then the anger was done. And then I could get on with answering emails or whatever I had to do in the moment. Right. And I think that's part of it's not a problem. It's just part of the way our system evolved, is that we're not used to thinking really long term. And we have a lot of trouble thinking, like planning through, like, what's Jay going to do about climate change over the next 50 years? I'm really good at thinking, how many emails do I need to answer today? And what do I want to have for lunch today? That's how my brain can predict, right? Most of us are that way. And so, but then we have these much like climate change and politics. These things are really longer term issues that are evolving over time in ways that are hard for us to really understand. But yet the system on some level still has to resolve that conflict. Or else it just causes massive suffering. So,
and towards this, creating a future where we don't have suffering, because it seems like you did make this decision to have a baby. We want to start to get into what is sort of this amazing, beautiful, positive future that we could have, and how the technology that you work on with SanMai impacts that. And so before we get into that, I'd love if you could share just a little bit about what targeted ultrasound is, what you've sort of done with that, and then we can get into the potential of what it could do for us and humanity.
I'd even love to understand why you went with targeted ultrasound, because obviously there are so many different ways of interacting or impacting the brain, from magnetic stimulation to direct current and ultrasound, and so deep brain Neuralink. Why targeted ultrasound?
Sure. So when I was a graduate student, I was working with deep brain stimulation. So you guys might have heard of Neuralink, or your listeners have. Yeah. They're doing implantable electrodes into the brain. They don't go very deep, but there's something like that where you do a neurosurgery, you drill holes. The drill actually looks like a drill from like Home Depot. The first time I did it, I was like, whoa, that literally just like right into the head. And so,
oh God, I shouldn't laugh at that. That's dark. So you just held like a Home Depot drill and just
I didn't do it. The neurosurgeons do it, but they have stereotaxology. They have a way to navigate it. But it's basically 2 holes in the head. You dip an electrode down, and mostly they're using this for Parkinson's. But we also investigated obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, and so I just had this amazing opportunity to go into the operating theater, watch these neurosurgeons do this, and I was recording EEG from inside the brain, from those electrodes. And I saw, about 50 or so of these surgeries over my graduate career. And I could say like 99% of those were transformative experiences for the patients. Mm-hmm. Like talking about like this person retires, he's ready to play golf. Then he gets Parkinson's and his whole life is messed up. These are neurological diseases, but there's a mental health burden, obviously for these people. Yeah. And literally the first surgery I saw, it was pretty crazy. I'm scrubbed up. I look like a doctor. I was like playing like I was on one of those doctor TV shows. It was a lot of fun. And I have pretty good like bedside manner. So they put me talking to the patient while they're getting brain surgery. And it's freaking crazy. I mean, you just hear the drill going in their skull. And the patient's asking me like, what's going on? I'm like, well, you're getting a hole in your head, Oh, and so that was the whole situation. And then they turn the electrode on and this guy's tremor. So this is a Parkinson's patient. He's tremoring. They find the right energy to put into his brain and his hand just freed up and his tremor went away and he starts crying. The nurses start crying. I start crying. I'm like, whoa, what is happening? This is like a miracle of, medicine and science. And so after the 50th one of these... And in those cases,
Jay, it's a permanent electrode, right, that they leave inside the brain? Yeah.
Permanent electrode has a battery that they wire under their skin. So they actually wear this battery in their chest. It's pretty wild. Yeah. And then, it doesn't stop the disease, but it basically gets to the point where they're functional in their life, and that completely changes their lives. And so, I watched all these surgeries, and I just became obsessed with the question, why surgery? Like, isn't there a way to do this without surgery? Like, there's, and I'm a sci-fi aficionado. I love science fiction. So I've read a lot of like non-invasive brain stimulation stuff. And so I just started like really digging through the literature and asking like, is there a way to do this without the brain surgery, which is called non-invasively? And then it just turned out, like luck of the universe, a person that was working on non-invasive ultrasound to do this in the brain was down the hall from the surgery I was doing one day. There's a guy called Stuart Hameroff who has like a very famous theory of consciousness with Roger Penrose called ORCOR. And I knew about Stuart from a documentary called What the Bleep Do We Know? If anyone wants a fun, kind of quirky documentary, go check that out. But anyway, I was doing a surgery. It was like a 9-hour surgery on an OCD patient. And it was really hard to get this patient over from Mexico because she had OCD and she had canceled like 8 times. Like just getting on the airplane was like super hard for her. And she finally got to the operating room. We turned the stimulator on and her obsessions went away the moment they turned it on. It was like, wow. That doesn't always happen, but in this case, like boom. And so after that, I was like on fire. I was like, we got to find a way to do this so we can bring the device to this patient in her home. Like, why does she have to come all the way over here? And I saw Stuart Hameroff walking down the hallway and he was like, you can do this with ultrasound without drilling a hole. And I was like, oh my God, I'm in love. Like, you're my new friend. And so I just went down that path. And in the early days, no one had done that in humans until Stuart had done it. But there was a lot of animal studies already showing that you could basically non-invasively focus an ultrasound beam into the brain and you could modulate any brain circuit, basically, even deep in the brain. And so as a grad student, I just started reading all these studies and was like, holy cow, like we got to do this. Let's translate this into humans. And this is a story where belief, you gave this example about belief. I experienced that very deeply in science because all of my colleagues were like, ultrasound in the brain is electrical and chemical. What are you talking about? How could sound focused in the brain modulate the brain? It doesn't make any sense.
I actually wanted to ask you, what is your theory on how the neurons fire or however the brain gets affected by, because ultrasound should really be generating heat or something like that, right? Like, how does that work?
So we're using low energy ultrasound, and at that level, there's very little heat. So heat's
Hmm.
probably not a big mechanism. It might be a
Okay.
tiny bit, but it's really, and this is for me, like the intuition actually was there before the scientific beliefs and facts,
Hmm.
which is that the brain is this jelly system, right? It's a system that has mechanics to it, and it's sort of a
Right.
jelly substance. And what the sound is doing is it's moving a wave across that medium, and it's
Hmm.
moving it, it's stretching it, but safely so you're not damaging anything. And that stretching is causing a change in the electrical conduction. So you can think of the cells like a bit like a battery. And what happens if you take a battery and if you have a battery that's kind of dead and you shake it, sometimes you can get a little more energy out, right?
Sure.
Sort of same principle, right? You're doing a non-violent shaking of the system, and that's changing its electrical properties very subtly. And that's really the key is it's the subtle change in the electrical properties. It could be across the ion channels. We know the ion channels are stretch
Right.
sensitive, but also, there's other ways that you can change that conduction. And so it's probably multiple mechanisms. Also, we know that ultrasound changes blood flow in the brain, so there's probably a more general mechanism.
Mm.
And there's this whole other literature of ultrasound that I also was reading as a grad student, showing that ultrasound can help bones heal. So if you break your bone, you can heal the bone
Right.
faster. So there's all these kind of anti-inflammatory kind of healing properties that
Right.
ultrasound has.
And
So
with
it's a lot
ultrasound,
of
I
these
believe
mechanisms.
you can target a lot deeper compared to some other techniques like TDCS or TMS or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, mostly people are using direct current and magnetic stimulation. So those are FDA cleared or FDA doesn't care about them. And so, yeah, those are pretty powerful. You can do treatments of depression and things like that with strong magnets, but they don't go very deep and they're not very focused. And so that's when I saw ultrasound. You can focus sound through a lens. It's pretty cool. This old radar physics, basically, and or lensing physics. And so it's very, known stuff. I was reading all this as a grad student, like, holy cow, all of these parts are here. And this is the part where actually my mindfulness and other work allowed me to feel into my body and have an intuition of like, there's something here. Even though all the parts aren't arranged in the science yet, we don't have a full science on it. But if you really sat with all the different pieces of data, it was like, this is really potentially like super powerful if we can get it all together and we can test it. And so I started doing this work, even though a lot of my colleagues thought I was crazy at the time. Like, what do you do? Ultrasound in the brain? And my PhD advisor, John Allen, at the time told me, he was sort of into this because he loves experimental methods. But he was like, I was a visual perception researcher at the time. And so he said, you could do this, but you have to publish a really good paper in a top journal in the visual perceptions, because that's where you're going to, that's your bread and butter. And then if you do that, then I'll help you do this ultrasound stuff on the side. And so I was like, deal. We got a good paper published in psychological science, and then we got a grant to do the ultrasound work. And we ended up running the first 300 or so participants, human participants in our lab. And then basically now the whole field is really taken off. It's really exciting to see that.
And so maybe you could paint us a picture of what could be, right? Like if you were to see this 10 or 20 years out in the distant future, like what do you think is the potential that's possible?
Yeah,
Family, humanity, all of that.
yeah, I feel that the ultrasound, so this is focused, targeted neuromodulation that can be individualized or personalized. This is like one piece of the much bigger part of helping humanity and humans in general sort of steer towards a positive outcome. Sort of our better angels is what my collaborator Shinzen Young likes to say. And so what we're doing right now is targeting the first part, which is the brain network. But, always realizing that the human being is composed of the networks interacting with the body and the body interacting with other humans. So there's these three parts that we really have to keep in mind. And what we're doing right now is we're doing very targeted modulation of the first piece, and specifically for people who are deeply suffering, right? People with Parkinson's and people with dementia, depression, anxiety. we're starting from a place in humanity where we're languishing quite a bit due to our technology, I think a lot, and due to the economic system that we've set up and all that. So right now it's like help a person shift. That's crucial, very as quickly and safely as possible. Shift your perception, shift your mind, and then have the tools for change, for plasticity. That's step one. That's what the ultrasound, I think, can do. And over the next 10 to 20 years, we're really going to see very powerful network level modulation. But that in and of itself isn't going to help humanity all that much, actually, because we have something that does that. It's called opioids, right? And we've seen what opioids can do. And so the next step is actually building a support platform around that technology. And we're actually using LLMs, so conversational bots and other types of technological platforms to help people have the support. And then I think step three, where this really will click in and align, is when you have a way to connect the humans who are having transformative experiences through the tech to other humans who are having transformative experiences. And in my view, you got to connect them to humans who've got some wisdom, some experience with those transformations. And so, that's where I'm really excited is like we have targeted tech to change the brain and the mind. Then we have support tech around it. The LLMs, I think, are really useful for that. And then we have like network level technology. This is like a sort of psycho-spiritual Facebook or whatever you want to call it. That's right. Really helping people not like see themselves through the mirror of Facebook, but actually connecting, directly to other people who are having these types of transformations. And I think all this is already here. Like all this tech is already possible. That's what's so exciting to me, right?
Exactly. That's what's incredibly exciting and what, again, like I think what we think as kind of like humanity entering God mode. I had a personal experience 2 weeks ago, Jay, worth sharing with you about. I grew up in Sri Lanka with a bunch of traumatic experiences during my childhood, and done a lot of work using many different modalities over the years. And but then there's some certain lingering effects that I'm kind of like still kind of trying to work through. And I've also been diagnosed with depression that kind of comes up seasonally sometimes, and so something like that I've been like kind of figuring out how to address over many years, and I've always been kind of in the lookout for new things that I can try, and about 2 weeks ago I had a TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation session, an accelerated protocol where they did a TMS treatment over 10 hours, every half an hour, so like a 3-minute treatment, so 20 sessions in one day, and this was my friend Jishan Chowdhury, who we interviewed last week, who you might know actually, is starting a company to do this, and to both help people who have things like depression, where in my case they stimulated like a specific point, like in my dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, like right here, but like but also just like help people almost get to a supernormal state is the objective in some ways, where can you be like almost better than normal, right? Like if you look at certain founders, for example, CEOs who build amazing companies, they're almost like a little bit manic, right? Like they have like this boundless energy, and so a question that it's worth asking is that can you almost like get almost better than normal, right? So I had this treatment 2 weeks ago, and promising results so far. I feel pretty good. So curious how you think about kind of TMS versus ultrasound, and also what kind of results have you seen using ultrasound on both like kind of patients who have serious psychiatric conditions, but also like normal people. There are a number of startups working on ultrasound, like headwear type devices right now. How do you see all this play out? What kind of results have you seen out there?
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that experience. I mean, those types of clinical effects is what really drives me, because I've been seeing this now with ultrasound. I've worked with transcranial magnetic stimulation and direct current and actually light photobiomodulation, which I think is actually quite promising. So I've worked with all the modalities in deep brain stimulation, and seeing these types of things, I've heard these types of things, and I've experienced them myself, and that's really driving me to figure out how do we do that but scale it out. And that's part of the reason I'm on Team Ultrasound. But actually, I'm not wedded to ultrasound. Even my company Sanmai, we're really wedded to any way to scale that phenomenology. So that what we call lived experience that you just described, whatever tech is going to scale that so other people have access to it. And then as soon as you scale it, supporting it, that's really the key for the company. One thing I would say about what you just said is that I think it's really important to honor the work that you've done before you had the TMS. Yeah. Because actually you're stimulating into the brain. And this is where I even personally get caught up a lot in our sort of very sciencey sort of reductionist type framework, where you're stimulating into the brain and you're doing the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is a cognitive control center. But that stuff is all where the beliefs are. Going back to our earlier conversation, your beliefs are stored in this network of the thing you're stimulating into. And not only your beliefs, but the deep work you've done, the meditation retreats, that kind of stuff, that's all stored in there too. So you're stimulating into that system, and it's interacting very deeply with that whole nested hierarchy of all of that work. And so I would honor that as well. It's almost like it's, in my view, the stimulation's unlocking more of the work that you've done, so you can even do more of the work. And when you start framing it that way, it's a little bit more empowering, I think, even from our patients, and versus saying you're just zapping and you're making the symptom go away.
Jay, you've used a metaphor with me that really stuck about sort of like I think you sort of called it the gymnastics coach. I don't know if do you recall that? If maybe you could share that, because to me that really encapsulates how the technology can be used.
Yeah, so I was a gymnast as a kid, believe it or not. So I competed. My mom had a gym, and yeah, sort of thinking about it as a coach in general. What a gymnast coach will do is, you've learned all the mechanics of doing a backflip, but what they will do is they will support that mechanics. So they're giving you a little bit of a superpower because they're there kind of like giving you an extra hand, but the system is learning how to do that itself. And it's really important to go through the motions over and over again. And the ultrasound, the brain stimulation in general, that's what it's doing, is it is a stimulus going into the system, training it. It's actually a training about how to, in the case of depression, how to be that system, but not engaged in the rumination process, that loop, for example, that it gets into. When you're stimulating the DLPFC, it's actually training up the trainer. The DLPFC is the part that controls the brain, controls the cognition. And so you're training it to know what to do when those ruminative thoughts come on board, for example.
Well, and is it all right if I share my experience? Because I have been what you call sonicated. I've had the ultrasound. Yeah. And you've assured me that I was not in the placebo control group.
I do. I placebo people a lot. I'm very fascinated by placebos. But yeah, you got the real stuff.
Yeah. So you, what I recall is that you sonicated my amygdala, right? And I mean, it was an interesting experience. That was real. I felt like I was really in sci-fi, right? There was a device that went on my head. Someone was holding the what's it called that shoots the wave in there, the transducer. Yeah. Right? And they had a fMRI scan in my head and a screen where they could actually see. It would show where the wave was going to go into the brain, and so they sort of got it lined up and shot it in there. And what was interesting to me is at first it seemed very, very subtle. And then, I forget how long, it was only 20 minutes or something like that. And then you and I went out to dinner. And as I was eating dinner, I noticed that this sort of sense of peace and calm that was just sort of like subtly in the background seemed to be growing more and more intense. I mean, it's still just until it just sort of felt like I was resting in like a warm bathtub. And it would probably be my best way of describing it. But it's fascinating that the effect actually seemed to increase after the treatment was complete, which sort of
it's actually true for TMS as well. Why is that, Jay?
Yeah, so that gets into what's the mechanism, and there's neuromodulation, so there's direct modulation of the firing of the cells. The cells are always firing. Then there's the downstream, the longer term stuff that you're talking about is related to plasticity, neuroplasticity, and probably network level effects in the brain. That's actually what I'm more interested in. And I would say both are important, because if you have rumination and a habit, if the mind's locked in this habit, the ultrasound we've shown now in our anxiety trial can disrupt that habit. That's very important. Because for a patient, they learn, oh, it's possible for me to not be doing that. That's great. But the question is, how do you get it to stick? How do you get these longer term traits to happen? That's the longer term plasticity stuff. And we know that TMS and ultrasound both increase the plasticity. So they increase the likelihood for the system to change. And that for me is really awesome. And also why it's so important to start doing work in that window of plasticity. And hopefully we were having a good conversation, so you were laying down some happy tracks.
Yeah.
but that plasticity can actually go both ways. And so one worry I have is that you're in this window of plasticity and you go home and get on YouTube, and now YouTube is using the algorithm to get you to lay down another habit. And that's why for all of our patients, we tell them, there's this window of about 24 to 48 hours, we believe. And in that window, that's where you need to go get activated, go meditate, go to church, like whatever it is for you that's helping you change that habit. That's your chance. And so, that's really key. I think the other part underneath it is what my lab in Tucson is really interested in, which is this concept of equanimity, or the capacity for the system to be open. And that's related to plasticity. Openness and change are very interrelated. But I think that's really deeply what's happening, is that the amygdala, your system, is really in this habit loop, and it's totally natural and normal, but it gets stuck. And especially if it's threat oriented, it can get pretty stuck. And so I think a lot of what the brain stimulation is doing is giving the system equanimity, the capacity to be open fundamentally to experience, including negative experience. And what happens is when the system is in a more equanimous or a more state of openness, the system recognizes it. That phrase, game recognizes game. It's like the biology recognizes when it's open, openness recognizes openness. And that, if you can get that to align in the biology, that is extremely life-changing. And that's what, is actually happening to your question, Dylan, about some of our patients, is when our patient with anxiety opens to their anxiety, they a lot of times will start crying because they're like, oh my God, I knew this was possible. I just didn't know it was possible for me. I didn't know that I could be open, because anxiety has been such a bad word in my world. And not only did your ultrasound not make the anxiety go away, it actually made it warm and fuzzy, like you said, Ben. It sort of gives a different dimension to the anxiety. And okay, now I can use it. Whoa, what's this? I can use my anxiety, right? So now you're getting the engagement of the human being, in that whole process.
So one question that I have, Jay, is, and this is sort of in some sense, part of the mission of Sanmai, is you're going from this true lab experiment that I experienced to a device that's simple and one day, hopefully will be, affordable and accessible to every human on the planet. In a world where everyone can do this, I mean, do you see a place where perhaps mental suffering becomes optional? What happens in that world?
Yeah, I mean, probably not anytime soon, but that's the goal ultimately, is to give people the skills to open up to what's causing that suffering, and then to come from a place my friend Jeffrey Martin calls fundamental okayness. I love the phrase fundamental okayness, because that doesn't actually mean that the pain and even suffering will go away. but that your baseline state is going from threat and climate change and politics, that's what is very beneficial to the systems in place. And switching that to when the happens, I'm still coming from the place of fundamental okayness. And I think that is really possible right now, actually, in our lifetimes, hopefully at least in my daughter's lifetime, for the majority of humans on this planet. And that doesn't mean that they're not going to suffer, because climate change is still going to happen. The systems are still going to break and change. And in my view, that's okay. Actually, that's part of this whole longer term process that we're a part of. But it can mean that people are, because they're coming from a place of fundamental okayness, they're getting on doing the hard work, which is like, we probably should stop driving SUVs. We probably should have smaller houses. We probably should stop flying on our airplanes. Like, these are hard systemic truths that society is going to have to deal with until we get on to like finding cold fusion or something, right? And then we can go back to all the systems. But even the way we get to that, I think, is by like getting out of this threat orientation and getting on to curiosity, creativity, science and all that kind of stuff.
Well, what are the hurdles from where we are, the tech with ultrasound, for example, getting from here to, having a device that I can use daily at home or something? I know fMRI is one of the hurdles. How do you get around the need for that? I think one of the biggest technical things that you need to solve, right?
Yeah. You were asking, there's a lot in this space. So neurotech in general, but specifically in the ultrasound space, there's a lot of companies coming up. It's really awesome to see all the interest. And in my view, all boats will rise as the field rises. But one place that we're a little different as a company is trying to get over some of those hurdles using deep neural networks, AI, machine learning, these types of tools that we have right now. I'm so excited about these tools because I'm pretty sure AI is not going to kill us anytime in the near future, but it's actually going to solve some really hard and kind of boring problems to talk about. So it's much more fun to talk about Terminator than it is to talk about how, my company is using deep neural networks to solve the skull aberration or skull distortion problem. So the skull distorts the focused ultrasound beam. It's like a bad prescription glasses. It's like you went to the doctor and they gave you the wrong glasses. That's what the skull is doing to the beam. And we use deep neural networks and machine vision learning, and over like a 6-month period made this model. And now on your skull, we can focus the beam to the right spot. That's the first step to scaling this out. Like without that, and I'm sorry to tell all my friends who have companies not doing this, like you have to do that. If you really want to get reliability at scale, that's really the harder problem. You can scale stuff all day, but is it going to work? And so, that's where it's like, if you mix the AI with some of the sort of hardware stuff that we're building, that's quite exciting. Because if you would have asked me even 2 years ago, like, can I solve some of those problems with the best engineers in the world? I would have said no, actually. Like, it's just too complex. Now you can feed those complex problems into these machine learning models, and out you get these like elegant solutions. So, that's quite exciting. But, that is like just the steps towards reducing the cost of the hardware and the like reliability of it over time. And I still think that's, 5 to 10 year process that we're going through. But we do know that ultrasound itself can be scaled because it's out there in all kinds of other types of technologies. And so, we'll get to that point where the technology is working at home. The other piece for me is like, how do you actually support the human being as you have a really deep tech device out at the home? And that's where, again, I would have said, I wouldn't do that. Actually, if you go listen to my podcast from a couple of years ago, I would have said, you shouldn't do ultrasound at home. And I still believe that. So anyone trying to do focused ultrasound at their house right now, it's totally not safe. And I wouldn't recommend that. Partly because once you get a device that's really reliably moving perception and the sense of self in a new direction, you have to have support. There's no way around that. And that's why in Buddhism, you have the Sangha, that's why in Catholicism, you have the church. Like you need physical locations, you need other human beings to really help you. Yeah. And now with LLMs, I think we have the first piece of that process, actually. Right. And I don't think that's the last step. You always have to have humans in that loop. But now, as I think, like, if we get really lucky and we get through the FDA, we get a clinical device out, we got to do those steps first. But eventually, if we get to the point where we can get a device at home, by 5 years from now, when all that's happening, we're going to have an amazing, bot, like wherever the LLMs are by then, and we may have AGI. I'm not super confident that's going to happen in 5 years, but something close to that by that time, you're going to have like a deep meditation teacher plus a deep therapist plus your spiritual teacher, like, and your best friend, like, all in your pocket. Like, it's really kind of crazy to think about that.
That's kind of funny that my company is right now trying to build at least that exact same thing, Jay, using LLMs. Awesome. Totally agree. And even if we just focus on post therapeutic, like kind of integration part, like a lot of these modalities are really powerful, but then they are dramatically lacking in the integration part, right? Because you just like, do your ayahuasca or whatever, and then you go home and like, what do you do next? I mean, some people are more motivated to do like kind of self-guided therapy, but most people probably don't really do much. And so that's what I think you're referring to here. If you could come back home, and if there could be an LLM coach that kind of takes you through a number of steps to enhance the effect, that could be really powerful. Have you guys played with anything like that with what you do, and seen any results? How do you think you guys will work with that?
Definitely. So with my collaborator Shinzen Young, we've been playing with that in my lab in Tucson. We call it the Ramona Project, after Raymond Lull, someone that Shinzen really likes, from sort of the inventor of AI in a certain sense in the 1200s. But yeah, we've definitely been playing with that in relation to support on the meditation retreats. And then my company also has already started making these bots. So we're using OpenAI's infrastructure. And
that's very cool.
Like, again, I would have said even 6 months ago, I would have said, I don't know. I just think they hallucinate too much and all this. And they're getting so good so fast. And they don't have to be a full human because, like I said, you always need humans in the loop. But what they do is they do the set and setting, the priors, the expectations that we talked about. So we do that before the treatment. So what should the patient expect? What is this concept of openness? These types of things with my collaborator, Judd Brewer. Those types of things actually likely will really impact the experience the person has. And then the key right now is you got to have that experiential shift. That's the key to motivating the person to keep going. And that's where I think the LLMs by themselves will work for people who are motivated, but for the vast majority of people, actually, they're not going to work yet, unless something motivates them to do it. And so when you match that, like, what's possible with your phenomenology with the ultrasound, with the support, so the bot can then go with you in your life. And just one example, a lot of our patients will say, I'm reconnecting with my cat. It sounds a little bit funny, but actually for a person with anxiety, that's a huge deal because you have this creature that depends on you and that's snuggling you every day. And you're almost like distant from them, they're an object to you instead of like something that gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling. So what the bot does is it says, oh, that's really interesting. Let's see what else we can apply that to. That's integration, right? Because now it's in your life. And almost always the answer is, well, what about my wife or my daughter? There's always a human being who you want to have that level of openness with as well. And so that's the immense power of these types of bots.
One question along these lines is, I'd be curious for you to share with us, what's one of the most profound transformations that you've witnessed in someone using your approach and this technology?
There's been a few, I'd say out of the over 1,000 subjects we've run, it's still in the tens. It's not a huge number right now. And that's where it's like, that's where making it work better through the focusing through the skull and all that's going to really up that number. But I would say we've had a couple patients with depression in our depression trials who've had radical shifts in their relationship to negative emotion. and a couple patients who basically they don't identify as a depressed person anymore. I wouldn't say it's cured, because they still have sort of cycles that come back. But what's really radically shifted for these people is that the ultrasound allows them to see the other side of depression, which is like usually they can't see positive sides of things. And, they often say after the ultrasound, it's like their windshield was clean. Depression makes the world kind of dark and you see the negative, and now it just wipes the windshield. And that becomes possible for them so that when the next really stressful life events happening, they have this inner skill to do that themselves. And so that's been, really transformative for some people. We've had a few participants go through the meditation protocols in my lab in Tucson who, through the protocol, realize, they have like first level insights, like, I'm not my thoughts. For a person who's like 20-ish years old to start realizing, I'm not my thoughts is a really deep and life-changing insight. And we've had a few of those people go pick up like long-term meditation practices. I actually heard from a participant who's was in the study 3.5 years ago now. And he's gone on like multiple like month-long Vipassana meditation retreats and all of these types of things. So, again, it's like what the ultrasound does in these limited sessions is it really is showing people what's possible, and then it motivates them to take on their own path. And that's really makes me feel better about doing this, because it's really activating the autonomy of the human being, which is the goal of my company, and giving them the keys to their own path, right? Versus like just permanently changing them. Because if it permanently changed them, I'd be a little scared, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of what Aldous Huxley called psychedelics as sort of the doors of perception. You get to open them and get a peek behind the curtain, and but then you go do the work.
100%.
It's probably a good jump off point to something that I wanted to ask you about. I thought some of the most interesting work you've done is around meditation and meditators and consciousness itself, and you mentioned Shinzen Young, who is maybe you can actually introduce him to the audience and talk about that, and yeah, I just love to dive into a bit about the work you've done in that space, which is really fascinating.
Sure. Yeah, happy to dive in. Shinzen is my co-collaborator, co-inventor of my lab in Tucson called SEMA Lab, Science Enhanced Mindful Awareness Lab. And Shinzen is one of the OG teachers in the United States who went to the Far East, learned the practices. He actually became ordained as a Buddhist monk for a while. He's not a monk anymore. And took those practices and westernized them so they were palatable for a Western audience. And he's really one of the original people in our country that did that. He's also a beautiful mind. He's a scientist. He's just an incredible human being to be around. And I would say something that our culture is really missing is an example of what deep practice looks like. We hold up basketball players. I'm a big basketball fan, so like Steph Curry and LeBron James, great people, but they show what's possible when you work really hard at sports. And what Shinzen is an example of is what happens when you do the really deep inner work and train your mind through these practices. And you get this example of a human being who, in my view, has what we might call anti-fragility. He's a person who grows under stress, grows under, if suffering is happening, it's making him grow actually and becoming even deeper in his practice.
So he's sort of the Steph Curry of meditation.
100%. Yeah. And the Steph Curry is a good example. He's my favorite basketball player because he's so good, I think, because he also has equanimity on top of the training, right? And I think that's what separates a really good pro player from the rest of them who are all equally skilled.
And I think you've done both some observational studies on the kind of the state of mind, how it changes during meditation, but also studies on how you can affect the state of mindfulness using ultrasound and such techniques. I'd love to learn a bit about what did you observe, what did you learn through these explorations?
Definitely. Part of what my lab is interested in is what happens when people do deep practice and have deep transformations of self and perception. And that's sort of the double-edged sword of long-term practice is it changes you, and it's not always a linear process. It's not always good outcomes, actually. So, for example,
Really?
a lot of people, even on their first long retreats, will have motivation issues, what Shinzen calls flatlining. And if you radically
Is it
reorient,
motivation to meditate, or motivation, like, does motivation go away from wanting to do other things in life?
I would say if you're really lucky, it's all your motivation. Because, a lot of us are driven by fear and the
That's
deep
true.
sort of limbic system of,
Yeah.
I got to make all this money so I can go do this thing. And you're driven by this whole apparatus that at the end of the day is a house of cards. And the sort of dirty little secret is most people figure that out on their deathbed, right? You realize what was really important and that you might have prioritized a lot of things that weren't super relevant for deep, connection to family and nature and life. And so, that happens on retreat as people sometimes realize, oh my God, I don't really need my second BMW M3 and my Porsche. These things are just causing me more suffering, or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm a big car guy. And so, that sort of piece drops away and the motivations that are attached to it. And that becomes a problem actually for a lot of people because that's what drives us to do the work that we do and answer our emails and all the stuff that gets us through the day. And that's great. That's what my lab is really interested in is how do you help a person integrate that to get through that to the deeper store of energy, what you could call the source or whatever you want to call it. Because when you have a person coming from that place, the place of fundamental well-being, the energy is unlimited, the motivation's unlimited, the happiness is unlimited. It's, when you're sort of not coming from the self part, you've got nature to pull from. And that's, the place I think that my lab is trying to get people to and the company ultimately as well. And I think what's possible for almost every human being is that's like right here in front of their faces. But as a meditation teacher, you can't tell people that, you can't shake a person and say, wake up out of your suffering, right? You got to give them the tools to do that themselves.
Yeah. I'm so glad you're speaking to that too, because as a executive coach, a lot of founders that I speak to, they have that fear. They go, oh, well, I can't do the meditation practice now.
Yep.
Because the stereotype is that you're going to go be a monk and live up on the mountain and let go of all your worldly things. And what I hear you saying is that actually when you let go through the practice, when you let go of all the fear, there's just a deeper well of energy that emerges that motivates you, and it feels great.
100%. Yeah, I know it's a little corny. I'm a surfer, so there's the surfing analogy is really good here. And that, if you resist the wave, it's getting down to the basic principles of Buddhism, which is like if there's pushing away or grabbing on, which is in the Buddhist model, that's the cause of suffering or one of the major causes. If you're on a wave and you're resisting the wave, or you're like, if you have an image of what a surfer looks like and you're trying to do that, versus just being present with what's going on that surfboard, you're not going to surf. You're going to fall off and probably hurt yourself. And actually, I think that's an analogy for our whole species right now. Like we have this image of what it looks like to be a president in the United States right now, or what it looks like to be a business leader or whatever. And those things we're not surfing the wave of the current reality, that we're living in. And the same is true for a startup. I mean, I'm a CEO of a company now, and I feel lucky to have the capacity to have these skills to surf the wave of a startup, because it takes a lot of dynamic flexibility, a lot of falling off, getting back on, doing it again. But once you learn how to get upright and play on the wave, it's incredible. There's so much energy because you're on the wave. You're getting the energy from the wave, actually. And you can't describe that to a person until they do it themselves. And I think that's as you know, as a coach, you can talk about it, you can use poetry, you can show videos, it's whatever. But when the person stands up on the surfboard for the first time, the energy, the vibration that they feel is they get it. And then they want to surf over and over again. You're like, I can do it. You know, so.
Well, one question I want to get to is, you know, you've done so much work to develop this technology, to bring it forward, to see the potential. I'm curious how you've used it on yourself and what impact it's had, if any.
The ultrasound particularly, or just any of it?
Yeah, the ultrasound.
Yeah.
Or if there are any other technologies that you use that have had a lot of impact.
I've used a lot of them, you know, and I think they're all useful doors. The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley was a foundational book for me as a teenager and young adult. That opened this whole path for me. So I think that analogy is really good. These are all different ways of opening these doors, and they're all leading to similar places, even though the paths are completely different. So yeah, I mean, I follow the principle of I will use this technology on myself because I won't do anything on myself that I wouldn't do on someone else. And so I don't actually use the ultrasound a lot on myself because it does change brain plasticity and it's changing the brain. But I actually, you know, what really got me convinced to go down the path of ultrasound and meditation is I did something called the Finder's Course. This is my friend Jeffrey Martin's course. It's a very intensive 15-week meditation course. And you do it in life. So it's like a life practice. It's really great. And when I was postdocing, I decided to combine that with ultrasound. So I did this under an experimental protocol. We had the right approvals and everything, and did this in the lab. And I did multiple weeks of ultrasound, so, you know, a couple minutes every third day in the middle of this retreat. And the idea was to see, would the ultrasound to something called the default mode network, which is sort of something that kind of gets in the way of meditation in a very broad sense. If I try to inhibit that system during the retreat, can they interact together and give me a big boost to the retreat? And long story short, it radically changed my life because I saw what was deeply possible for me in my own practice, which was I got to see what life was like when I wasn't holding on so tight to the sense of self. I would say from the highest level, when the self kind of loosened up, and it didn't go away because I think you need the self, but you don't need the self to be a solid rock. And I got to experience the world of the self being basically like a hologram. And when the self is a hologram, you can ride the wave. And when you ride the wave, everything becomes way more possible. And so my life just radically changed in those few weeks.
Beautifully said. And, you know, one of the things that we talk about a lot is part of becoming godlike. Gods are often in service, right, of bettering humanity. And you told me the story, and I don't know if this was this series of T-fuse treatments you did on yourself or a subsequent one, but I remember you talking about the janitor in your lab, and you had been doing these treatments and doing meditation, and he just came to you. He's like, I don't know what you're doing, but I want to do that. And, you know, to me, that's one of the places where when we start to see the effect of our own shift on other people, and that invites them into the path, that's really profound. Like, that's when we know that we're starting to have ripple effects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I would say at that point in my life, I was an aspiring academic, which is a really hard field to be in right now because there's like one job for every 100 PhDs or something crazy. Maybe it's not quite that bad, but it's something, you know, one job for every 20 PhDs. And I was on the upslope of that. So it was a very depressing time to be applying for jobs. And I had like a victim mentality. I was the victim of the choices of all these people had made before me. And that's why I can't get a job and, you know, all of this kind of stuff. And I was worried about climate change, and I was reading the climate science. And so there was a lot of like, I just didn't feel empowered to do anything to actually help people in this world, including myself. And going through that meditation course, doing that work, and allowing the thing in me that was feeling like the victim to just loosen up and be less in the foreground, like just go in the background and calm down and rest a little bit. Allowed me to actually figure out what can I do as this human with these skills in this world that feels to me like it's collapsing. what can I actually do that feels like it's going to make an impact? And I think that's crucial. I think that's a problem that every human being has, even if they don't ultimately want to go reduce suffering, which is what my goal is. You still have to think, what can I do? What impact am I going to have? And so, you know, that's what it really opened up for me, was allowing those parts of my narrative to rest a little bit, so that the part of me that could say, what can I actually do? I'm not going to solve climate change. I'm not going to, you know, start a company and, you know, make a device next week that's just going to wake up humanity. You know, these are all kind of silly things that actually made me feel very small. And going through this process, it allowed me to kind of be present with like the person in front of me and ask the question, what can I do right now to reduce the suffering of this person? And a lot of times the answer was nothing. You know, then that was a hard answer, because I want to feel like I can always do something, but it actually allowed me to like set boundaries with people in my life, and allow me to then come from a place of authenticity to actually say and do the things that would actually help that person or help myself in that moment. And that's what people were really sort of responding to, was like, oh, Jay's showing up from a place of authenticity. And a lot of times it was to tell the person something that, you know, actually they didn't really want to hear on some level, you know, but was coming from a place of compassion. And so, you know, that practice has really stayed with me, of really being like vulnerable and authentic in my own current experience, so that I can figure out, like, can I actually help in this moment? And if the answer is no, where do I go so that I feel like I can actually help in this moment?
Wow, that is so well said. And so as we start to come to a close here, I'm curious that if someone were listening and they're feeling stuck, right? Maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's lack of purpose, or feeling overwhelmed, you know, in some of the ways that you described. Where would you want them to start tomorrow morning?
Yeah, I would say what's really important, now that you know that your brain's making these predictions, and now that what I just talked through, of taking the tiniest little step that feels like you have some control or some impact, even over your own behavior, that is really crucial, because at the end of the day, we want to get to habit change, to behavior change. That's a really hard thing to do. But if you do it step by step each day in a way that feels right to you, you know, something that you can actually do, you have to start there. So don't actually look at the long-term thing. The limitation that we have is we're not very good at long-term thinking, but that's actually a power, and a superpower in this case, because you got to flip that around and say, what can I do right now to make a change? And then once you do what in Shinzen system we call the feel good practice. So loving kindness, metta bhavanya, any of these kind of loving practices. Once you have a little win, you have to try to find a way to love that win. So love the thing that's winning, which is you. And it can be tiny. You know, for me in the early days, I would reward myself with one Skittle, because I really love Skittles. And it's a childhood thing, so I don't want to eat a lot of Skittles. And so I would love myself by giving myself a Skittle, because in the early days, I was not capable of actually loving myself in a out loud way. But whatever it takes, you know, take that one little step to sort of say, hey, you're doing okay.
Love that.
So a 2-minute meditation and then a Skittle.
Exactly. Or whatever your Skittle is.
Great. And then the last thing I want to ask is, you know, we've heard so much about what Sanmai is doing and the promise here of ultrasound. If someone wanted to learn more or participate in a study like this, what would you suggest?
Yeah, so we are finally out of stealth. You can go to our website now, which is sanmai.tech, SANMAI.tech. So you can see that we're going to be posting all the experiments there. And I would say, you know, for anybody out there, anything with ultrasound or brain stimulation should be done under an experimental protocol. It's called an IRB. So just don't go to some random garage where someone's building these things. Come to our study or some of the other groups that are doing these. And they're all over the place now. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you can see all the studies that are going on. So you can go sign up for those. But definitely do it under the right protocols.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jay. This is such a wonderful conversation, diving into so many topics across making people better, ultrasound, child experiences, and the narrator in the mind, and all that stuff. So it was super fun.
Really, pleasure.
And to all the listeners, hopefully you enjoyed this, and please subscribe, hit that like button, support us in our podcast, and let us know how we can improve. And we'll see you all next week with another amazing guest. Thank you very much.